I hope you had a sufficient amount for lunch. Those of you who stayed for lunch, those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Patricia Kirkpatrick, and I am one of the conveners of this symposium, and it is my pleasure to be able to introduce the various speakers to you for this afternoon, of which there will be three. Now you say, three, Patricia, what have you been drinking? There are only two seated at the desk, but in actual fact, we are being joined by Professor Esposito from afar via Zoom. He unfortunately couldn't join us and graciously accepted to be quote unquote zoomed in. I don't know whether that's grammatically or any other way correct, but I'm assuming that language grows, right, as our technology grows. This afternoon we have then three speakers, Maître Amar and Maître, can I call you Maître, do you mind? It's a title that is very often used here in Quebec for those who are lawyers, so Maître Shukla. But first, Maître and Emmanuelle Amar, who saved me at the last minute. You know, everybody saves me at the last minute. There were individuals who were going to be part of this panel that couldn't be here, and I asked her whether or not she wouldn't be willing to be a part of this happy group. And she said yes. I think probably not knowing what she was saying yes to. But Emmanuelle Amar is the Director of Policy and Research here in Quebec for the Center of Israel and Jewish Affairs. And so you can imagine that she has been particularly busy these past 2 weeks and nevertheless has grown to have a certain kind of perspective on the subject that she is going to broach today, which is, of course, anti-Semitism. She does so by giving us some of her thoughts in a paper, Understanding Anti-Semitism, How to Counteract the Harms of this Lethal Phenomenon. So will you please welcome Maître Amar to our gathering as she speaks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you, Professor, for the invite to be here today. It is really a pleasure to be able to join you at this very important time and these very important discussions that we're having as part of this symposium. So I'm going to focus today on talking to everyone about, yes, anti-Semitism, to understand this deeply rooted phenomena, but specifically from the angle of conspiracy theories, because a lot of conspiracy theories still from today have at their root some anti-Semitic tropes. So hatred of Jews is one of the oldest forms of hatred in the world, officially dating back to Roman times. Judeophobia specifically refers to religious anti-Semitism, and anti-Jewish racism in general have existed for centuries. And there's one thing that's really important with anti-Semitism. It's to understand that it has a changing nature. It consists of attributing to Jews the worst thing of society at a given time. So the worst defect of what we feel are the worst things of humanity, that's what we'll say Jews have or Jews are. So for example, in the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism took the form of accusations such as the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. As nationalism developed in the 19th century in Europe, it evolved into assertions that Jews were disloyal or a threat to nation states where they lived. For socialists, Jews were capitalists. And in capitalist societies, oh, well, Jews are communist. Damn if you do, damn if you don't, right? So it's really has a changing nature with what is the worst at any given time, and pins it on Jews. And so that's why sometimes it can be tricky for some to really understand its nature, because it's really adapting and transforming itself. But there's one thing that I'd like people to take away, is there's one common thread, and it's that anti-Semitism seeks to demonize, ostracize, and exclude Jews, and Jews are held responsible for society's problem. And so this old form of hatred, we find the origin of many anti-Semitic myths that were reinforced, for example, in Middle Ages, which still persist today. And some of these myths are from as far as the Middle Ages or before, while others have were added with the centuries. I've mentioned, for example, the one about Jews being responsible for the death of Jesus, Jews having too much power, are good with money, or Jews are disloyal, and the Holocaust didn't happen, right? So another constant throughout history is the idea of conspiracy conveyed by anti-Semitic tropes. And that's what I'd like to focus on. There's many forms of anti-Semitism, but I'm going to describe a few main ones, and you'll see that there's a persistence of conspiracy theories throughout those. So there's, for instance, religious anti-Semitism, right, which is the aversion of discrimination against Jews as a whole, and it's based on religious doctrines of substitution, which foresee or demands the disappearance of Judaism or conversion of Jews, for example, conversion into Christianity. And also it has blood libels. So for example, this is a very old anti-Semitic myth, but that Jews used blood of Christian boys for their religious rituals. And another form that we saw very strongly throughout history, what we call racial anti-Semitism, which is prejudice against Jews based on the belief or assertion that Jews constitute a distinct race or ethnic group with characteristics or traits of their own that are odious or inferior. Of course, the biggest example of that would be the ideology of Nazi Germany. And one of the things here is that whereas with religious anti-Semitism, Jews could convert and then be okay, which is not true because there was discrimination, but there was this notion that you could opt out if you want. With racial anti-Semitism, there's nothing you could do or that you can do and you're perceived as inferior and as someone, as we saw with Nazi Germany, that must be eliminated. There's also, I'll say just a few words on political anti-Semitism, which is hostility towards Jews based on the belief that Jews seek national or world power. That's something we hear often in conspiracy theories. It also has a tendency to blame the Jews for economic or political crisis or defeats, that sort of tropes. In some circles, we hear that you know, for example, you hear, oh, well, the creation of Israel was completely illegitimate and that it was an imperialistic plot. So you hear this notion of, you know, imperialism and wanting to dominate the world. And so what we're talking about here is this idea of global Jewish conspiracy controlling the media, controlling the economy, controlling government institutions. And then all those theories and all this evolution and transformation of the way anti-Semitism presents itself, where does it take us? I want to take just a second to share some statistics with you that are issued yearly by Statistic Canada here. This is the statistics on police-reported hate crime. So year after year, Jews are among the most targeted group for police-reported hate crime. And for the latest data available, which is for the year 2022, it was the hate crimes targeting the Black community and the Jewish community remained the most for Canada, with respectively 23% and 14% of all hate crimes. And if we take it to the category of most targeted religious minority, the Jewish community in Canada is 1% about of the population and represented 67% of religiously motivated hate crimes. So that gives you an idea of that even here anti-Semitism is a problem, and these statistics are reconfirmed year after year with change in the specific percentage, but the tendencies are the same. And we've seen this echoed around the world also. And so there's often based on anti-Semitism conspiracy theories that there's white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, right, that are really keen on using anti-Semitic tropes at the basis of their action. But as we see, as I go through some example, they're not the only ones, and it goes really from the left, from the right, when you look at conspiracy theories. And I'm just looking at the time. Okay, I still have time. So there's an issue in our society right now with disinformation. You all go online, we're constantly on our phones, and we see the disinformation that threatens everything we hold dear as a society. Peace, democracy, and more. And we've witnessed a big increase of disinformation and conspiracy theories targeting us all, but targeting Jews. And that's something we should all be concerned about. The spread of false and hateful information, it really impoverishes the public discourse, it undermines our democracy, and it endangers the most vulnerable people in society. And I'm hoping I have some time to get also to some solutions or how we can all come together to try to combat these phenomena. So as I was saying, the Jewish community is one of the big target of the disinformation campaign through conspiracy theories. But modern conspiracy theories that we see today are inspired by fundamentally anti-Semitic model. And one that I'd like to take a moment to mention, the Protocols of Elders of Zion, which I believe was mentioned this morning also. And it continued to draw on and register of this notion of globalist or elites in the world of finance, media, politics to really denigrate Jews. It was published in 1903. And this Protocol of Elders of Zion is a forgery of anti-Jewish literature that presents itself as a plan for Jewish people to conquest the world. And it's based then on this seems everlasting conspiracy theory. And this protocol of Elders of Zion is used today and still referenced by many conspiracy theorist funds or groups. Even Hamas has it in their constitutional charter. So they have a charter that was published in 1988, and the Article 32 of it makes a direct reference of it. So I'll just read a quote from it, but this Article 32, it says, after Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they will have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion, and so on. Their plan is embodied in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying. End of quote. But they're not the only one. This protocol of Elders of Zion is regularly mentioned up to today. It's also the basis for many groups, and the idea of global elites, global bankers, right, globalist control. The case in point here, you might have all heard of QAnon movement. So anti-Semitism is the basis for many of what they are promoting. I'll just say a few words on them, but it's a modern rearticulation of some of the classic themes of religious anti-Semitism that are at the base of the QAnon movement. The very common one is really this idea of all-powerful cabal ruling the world, and that a lot of QAnon adherents subscribe to. Another one is that's vehiculated by QAnon is the idea that cabal members extract a component from the blood of their victims, often children, to ingest it to prolong their life. So you see that this is a modern reiteration of the Middle Ages blood libel that Jews use blood for some of their religious rituals. And another one of, again, conspiracy theory. We all had to go through the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw how, for example, the Asian community was really targeted in Canada also, directly being blamed for what happened. And we also saw a rise in anti-Semitism at that time, looking to blame someone also for this pandemic. We saw comparisons of how the health measures are the same as what Nazi regime did during the Holocaust. And so while it's not exactly a conspiracy theory, it trivializes or minimizes the Holocaust, and then it feeds into the whole phenomena of Holocaust denial, which is also a form of conspiracy theory. And this is not new, so Jews were also blamed in the 14th century, for example, where there was the Black Death, right? So Black Plague, and have been accused of poisoning the well, and that's why there was this Black Death. And it's just, again, another reiteration. I'm mindful of the time, so there's a bunch of examples of today or recent incidents that also talk about conspiracy theories directly. There was, you might remember in Buffalo, there was on May 14, 2022, a supermarket shooting. And there was the murder of 10 people in Buffalo, and it was a mixture of awful anti-black racism, and a toxic ideology, conspiracy theory, known as the Great Replacement Theory. What's the Great Replacement Theory? It's the ideas that Jews are orchestrating non-white immigration in the United States to replace the country's white population. So, and again, this was the Great Replacement Theory, was what was mentioned as an inspiration by the killer. And there's many more examples in the recent days. But then this takes us to, okay, but what can we do? And I'm happy to discuss more when we have the question period after. There's quite a few things actually that we can all do to try to combat, this increase of hatred and propaganda by conspiracy theories. Because one of the most important force of propagation of conspiracy theory in our modern day is online platforms. We think that there needs to be a special attention to them. So the conspiracy theories that are vehiculated online are directly responsible for inspiring some of the perpetrators of attacks against synagogue in Pittsburgh and San Diego. There was a rabbi that was stabbed in Muncie in New Jersey, and so on. And and there was also the Quebec mosque terrible attack that was also inspired by conspiracy theories, and also in Christchurch. So we see this thread, and so we think there needs to be a national strategy of demanding that the online platforms are held accountable. You might have seen in the news, but they're trying to be less and less accountable. And the idea is that they should be accountable to control, and we should demand an obligation of result. So not best effort, but really to control the hatred that's spreading on there, because it's honestly, actually, it's the Wild West. And they have the capability to do more. There is, in Canada, we have, of course, the criminal code. There is a section for hate propaganda that exists already, but there needs to be stronger guidelines on how to best use them, so that both prosecutors and law enforcement, can more effectively enforce the hate speech provision that we do have. We were talking about also earlier Holocaust denial, Holocaust distortion. It's not illegal everywhere. It used to not be targeted by the criminal code in Canada until 2022. So now there is a criminal offense in the criminal code that's called willful promotion of anti-Semitism, but it's actually criminalizing Holocaust denial specifically. So there are the legal tools that are in place, but we need to enforce them. But that leads me to also, yes, we have the tools legally, but that's not enough. So if we're talking about conspiracy theories and online and leading to violence in the real world, we need also to focus on education. Our youth are they're born with a laptop in their hands, right? Or an iPad, even laptop is old school, like an iPad or a smartphone. But we need to have digital literacy campaigns so that people learn, yes, how to use them, but how to understand what is a good source of information, what is disinformation, how to spot it, and how to have the tools to be equipped to combat this. Because when you go online, it's really a rabbit hole. You're down the rabbit hole, and the algorithm is feeding you all these hateful content. So it's extremely toxic. If I'm talking about online anti-Semitism, it doesn't take long to see extremely hurtful content online, and then people repeat that and fall into this dark web that is very concerning. So I think that education is something that we really need to focus on, and also activities like today. I think it's so important what we're doing, that talking all together and having discussions between different communities, different faiths, all coming together to combat this hatred, because it really affects us all. So I'll stop now, and I'm happy to answer more questions in the discussion period. Thank you very much.
I think what we'll do is we'll entertain some questions after each speaker, as well as after the third speaker, Professor Esposito. So are there any comments or questions? Clarifications? All clear? It was so much.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you so very much, Maître Amar. And we'll come back. Our second speaker is, as I said, Maître Shukla. So Suhag Shukla has been the director, founding director, and is now the executive director of the Hindu American Foundation, a foundation that seeks in its mandate to address the issue of Hinduphobia. And so we really are very fortunate to have you with us as you share with us some of your own experiences, both educational and otherwise, but also your thoughts on your paper, From Words to Action, Operationalizing the Working Definition of Hinduphobia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kirkpatrick, Professor Sharma, Amanda, for your support and holding this very important conversation. I wholeheartedly agree with Ms. Amar that we need to talk about these issues more. They can be uncomfortable because, well, I'll talk about why they can be, why they can get uncomfortable. So from words to action, I'm a lawyer, and so yes, we do a lot with words, but we also want to act, and so I felt that that would be an appropriate place for me to contribute in whatever manner that I can today. So Hinduphobia elicits a lot of responses, from an acceptance of its criticality in defining anti-Hindu hate, to outright denialism rooted in an ideological conviction that the term has been appropriated by a Hindu right wing. Even those who are aligned with this conception have a lot of debates. I was kind of chuckling when you talked about Muslim phobia. I can't remember the words you used, but we have our fair share of that. People insist on Hindu odium, Hindumisia, Hindu dvesha, and this oftentimes ends up taking us down tangents rather than discussing the issue at hand. But I think that this working definition that was developed by scholars, including two here, I believe that Professor Sharma and Professor Long were both involved in that, as was Dr. Indu Vishwanathan, who couldn't be with us today. They gathered, I think it was online, in June of 2021, and developed a working definition of Hinduphobia. And I think that that's really a very constructive place to start a conversation on Hinduphobia in the public sphere. So today I'm going to do a couple of things. First, as a lawyer, I'm going to explore how legal science can assist in operationalizing a working definition and transform it into a powerful tool that allows us to recognize, report, and counter definitional Hinduphobia. I'll also delve into what I have kind of identified as various ideologies, both religious and political, that are root causes to malintent towards Hindus and Hinduism. Explore concepts of vertical and horizontal hostility to understand and maybe highlight how recognizing Hinduphobia can sometimes be complicated, and also offer some stark examples of what I consider, and many consider, Hinduphobia. So, how does legal science fit into all of this? When I looked at the definition, and I know it's going to be hard to read, so let me just read the definition quickly for you. Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Hinduism and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. Hinduphobic rhetoric reduces the entirety of Sanatan Dharma, or Hinduism, to a rigid, oppressive, and regressive tradition. Pro-social and reflexive aspects of the Hindu tradition are ignored or attributed to outside non-Hindu influences. This discourse actively erases and denies the persecution of Hindus while disproportionately painting Hindus as violent. These stereotypes are used to justify the dissolution, external reformation, and demonization of the range of indigenous Indic knowledge traditions known as Sanatan Dharma. Now, in that, you may have heard actually some overlapping themes with what Ms. Amar just presented. And I think we could probably have session upon session on the intersections of anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. So what I saw immediately in this definition was intent and impact, similar to an intentional tort or crime. So Black Law's dictionary defines intent as the state of mind accompanying an act. So obviously it's a state of mind. It's not something that's necessarily visible. Maybe sometimes we get that smoking gun of someone saying something that coincides with an action. But oftentimes we have to look at surrounding circumstances and facts to kind of garner what might be happening. But in the definition, you see three terms, or at least I saw three terms: antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory, that kind of provide these states of mind. Antagonistic is an aversion or a dislike of Hindus and Hinduism. Destructive is that it doesn't want Hinduism or Hindus to exist, and derogatory, it doesn't respect the tradition. Impact, as gleaned from the definition, are adverse and harmful. It's actions or conduct that instill prejudice, fear, and hatred towards Hindus. It reduces Hindus or the tradition to a backwards and oppressive people blindly following a backward and oppressive tradition. It erases and denies persecution that's been faced historically and today. And it demonizes and dehumanizes Hindus as violent. And then we see erasure, persecution, desecration, and destruction are then thus justified. So what shapes these malintentions? And I've identified 5 ideological motives. This is by no means exhaustive, but they're the ones that come through in many of the incidents of Hinduphobia that we have been looking at over the past 20 years. Now, sometimes they're independent, oftentimes they're intersecting. So you have religious exclusivism or supremacy, this idea that there's only one true religion, and from that emerges a distaste or a dislike for Hinduism. There's racism, the belief that humans can be divided into separate exclusive biological entities called races, and that there's a causal link between that biological entity and things like personality, intellect, morality, culture, and behavioral features. And then there's ideas of superiority enmeshed into this ideology that some races are superior to others. Imperialism and colonialism. I'm not going to define those terms. I know there's people who could give full lectures on that here today. And then Marxism, or today's progressivism. It's a political, economical, or social doctrine that at a baseline opposes perceived hierarchies. Patriarchy, heteronormativity, whiteness, and that also plays in. I'll show how. Interestingly enough, for all the noble opposition to hierarchies, progressive causes in the United States are often very well funded. And then modernity. Foucault identifies a number of traits: questioning or rejecting tradition, privileging science over reason, and reason over intuition, secularization and individualization. So how do these motives then intersect with different contexts? Well, I found that this notion of vertical and horizontal hostility really helped provide kind of a framework to understand Hinduphobia. So vertical hostility generally refers to external forces to a community. So imperialism and colonialism, those two ideologies that I spoke to, especially in the Indian subcontinent, because we're talking about Hinduphobia, come into play. And again, while political and economic factors are the driving forces behind imperialism and colonialism, we can't talk about either without talking about religious expansionism, and specifically ideas of religious exclusivism coming along with that. And then there's the resulting disparities that emanate from colonialism and more colonialism in terms of wealth today, as well, and key institutions. The institutions especially where policies are made or narratives are built, so academia and media. Horizontal hostility is defined as internal. It's where people within a community are hostile to one another. So this would be South Asians expressing Hinduphobic things or working or conducting themselves in Hinduphobic manners against other South Asians, many of whom would also be Hindu. So what are the causes of eating our own? There's the lasting effects of colonialism and the legacy of colonial educational and legal systems. And then there's a lack of access to our own historical narratives. The very way in which Hinduism and Indology are framed were colonial exercises, and we have not yet shaken that structure off of the way that Hinduism is talked about or studied. And then I talked about Marxism, and this comes in this horizontal hostility framework. That while it failed, generally speaking, as an actual economic or governance model, it is a predominating model in the academic study of history and society. So what we find in the context of India and Hinduism is a sloppy and kind of uncritical force-fitting of the Marxist oppressor framework onto Hindus as a monolith majority in India, but then that also follows them as a minority in the United States and through the diaspora. And the postmodern version of this is that the Hindu, specifically Brahmin male, morphs into the white cisgendered male in the Western system and becomes white adjacent. I've seen similar things being said about the Jewish community. And then among South Asians, notions of modernity, where rejection of tradition is seen as the more modern, the more scientific way to be. And so all of these impact, or these are the contexts rather, in which we see Hinduphobia emerging. Now that sounds like a lot of complex, now how am I supposed to take this out into the real world? And we deal with members of the community. They range from second-generation Hindu Americans like myself who were born and raised in the United States, to new immigrants, to people who came to the United States in the 1960s. So what we did at the foundation is we created a glossary that could at least make it a little bit easier to recognize where Hinduphobia might be driving a particular narrative. Because a lot of these things are very complex, they're nuanced, and they're actually more often than not coming from other people from within the community. And there's all of those ideologies that underwrite it. So this kind of gives you a close-up. If you click on each one of those buttons, different glossary terms come up. They're oftentimes found throughout social media. Sometimes they're on mainstream coverage. Sometimes they're associated with hate crimes. But these are common terms that we found that were or associated with Hinduphobic conduct. So I'll just pick on one, and that's dual loyalty. This is someone who has two separate loyalties or allegiances and potentially entails a conflict of interest. Alternatives to the dual loyalty trope amongst Hindus or towards Hindus is calling Hindu Americans Hindu nationalists. We've been called Nazis and fascists. I won't go into detail as to why why that just on its face is problematic. The use of Nazi for anyone other than a Nazi diminishes the horrors of the Holocaust. But the dual loyalty tropes basically raise suspicions about Hindu Americans' Americanness. It attributes a malintent to us, and it falsely places us as arms or weapons of an Indian political movement and the excesses of Indian political discourse. It paints Hindus as inherently anti-Muslim and anti-Christian, and as if Hindus are seeking special rights for minorities in the United States while wanting something different in the subcontinent, so hypocritical. What, at the end of the day, tropes of dual loyalty do, no matter who they are pointed towards, they demonize and they delegitimize the causes that different communities advocate for. Before I get into some of the concrete examples of Hinduphobia, I think it's important to talk about what's not Hinduphobia, because if you're going to call anything and everything under the sun Hinduphobia, I think it loses its power. And so, it's pretty simple. Things that are genuine appreciation as opposed to appropriation. Genuine appreciation acknowledges the roots or the source of something and benefits from it. Appropriation is when you try to deny the foundations of something. Intellectual curiosity, and that can be from within or outside of the faith communities. If it's to deepen, evolve, or reform a tradition, that's something that's more internal to the tradition, that's likely not Hinduphobia. And lastly, misunderstanding and lack of awareness. I think the latest Pew study shows that Hinduism is one of the least known about religious traditions. And so I think it's important to, if you have a hammer, you're going to look for nails, or however that phrase is. But I think it's important to say off the bat that it's important to distinguish between what is Hinduphobia and what's not. So I created this word cloud because these are kind of some of the themes that I'll be talking about of how we see more and more commonly different iterations of Hinduphobia. Right-wing Hindu nationalist, Hindutva, Hindu supremacist, Hindu extremist, that were anti-others, casteist, oppressive, violent, dually loyal. All of these are motivated by one or a combination of those 5 ideological motivations that I talked about, and the effect is to instill prejudice, fear, and hatred towards Hindus. It delegitimizes our concerns and dehumanizes Hindus. So I'll talk about 2 primary arenas, Hinduphobia on campus, and then also Hinduphobia in the public square. I kind of mentioned this, but I would argue that, some may say that the very roots of Hindu studies has in Hinduphobia rooted in it, because the earliest studies of the Hindu tradition were a colonial exercise. But we see, so I won't get into that, but we'll just talk about a recent example. This is the Dismantling Global Hindutva online conference that occurred in September of 2021. Global Hindutva. Now, Hindutva, however you define it, is a political movement, has some sort of saliency in the Indian subcontinent, but now we're looking at a global conspiracy of Hindus about to do something bad. I want you to also take a look at this imagery. There's a hammer, and they're, unrooting or getting rid of these. Orange is generally a color that is associated with Hindus, so we know that these are Hindu men. They're also depicted in the uniform that many people in the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, wear, and it's also in their salute. This letter, or this conference, was the brainchild of a professor of a university in my backyard, and also where my husband is faculty, University of Pennsylvania. She is a South Asian origin professor, so again, that horizontal hostility. She's boasted about her communist upbringing, so when we talk about Marxist frameworks, it may be her political ideology, but it likely is also affecting kind of the ways in which she views the world, and specifically Hindus. The invitation letter, and I won't read from it, but it was a powerful demonstration of fear-mongering, otherizing, and dehumanizing Hindus as dangerous, castes, and expanding their reach not just in the United States, but the UK and Canada. Now, what made it clear that this was not an academic conference, at least to many of us on the ground, was that there were political activists who were part of it. And those political activists, as well as many of the scholars, had a long track record of saying very Hinduphobic things publicly. And what was even more concerning, though, because political speech is free speech, I think you mentioned the differences of free speech in the United States. What was most concerning is that this website had 65 logos of 65 leading universities across the United States. It alarmed parents and students to say, does this probably political event have the imprimatur or the stamp of approval from these universities? And so what we did as an advocacy organization was not to call for a cancellation, because we believe that they are entitled to say what they want. But it should not have a stamp of approval or the imprimatur of universities. So we launched a letter writing campaign, as did other community organizations. Students, parents, alumni, prospective students and parents were really concerned about the safety and well-being of their children, Hindu children on these campuses, wrote in. And within a matter of 48 hours, nearly 1 million messages were sent to those 65 universities. And within 24 hours of that public outcry, the logos were removed, because I don't believe that they were put on with permission. I'm going to play a short video of excerpts of that conference.
Are the panelists saying that the caste system is inseparable from Hinduism? And if that is the case, then why not dismantle Hinduism and not just Hindutva?
But as of now, I'm really not fully sure that there is a possibility of, given the short life the category Hindu has had, and it is embedded in casteism, I don't think it is separable from me. That's my argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaji. Can we hear from Banwar?
मुझे लगता है कि जाति हिंदू धर्म का हिस्सा ही नहीं है, बल्कि उसका फाउंडेशन है.
Could we have the interpreter explain what he has said?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Caste is fundamental to Hinduism. Take caste out of Hinduism and it cannot stand. That's why Hinduism opposes Ambedkar. Hinduism is not a religion. Caste is the religion.
There is no Hindutva without Hinduism. Hindutva is inextricably linked to and is a form of Hinduism.
Harboring the idea that Hinduism per se is harmless and only Hindutva is the culprit will not do any good to the observance of the lofty ideals, democratic ideals.
I say all this, and I'm just going to end. I just see my time's up. I say all this to emphasize, without hesitation, that Hindutva is indeed inseparable from Hinduism. And arguments of Hindutva is not Hinduism are deeply dangerous, Brahmanical, and laced with erosion and violence. They will not take us to the futures we aspire.
So a lot of the defense of this was, well, this is academic freedom. And that's why I really appreciated your remarks earlier, that where's the duty of care towards students, towards a community that's a micro-minority in the United States. We make up less than 2% of the entire population. Even the portrayals of the community driven efforts to counter the Hinduphobia in this conference. And again, we did not ask for canceling. It was a letter writing campaign, probably one of the most quintessential forms of protest. But you find an example, and I was hoping that Professor Esposito would be here, because I think that this poses a very interesting intersection where there's Hinduphobia being perpetuated under a measure that's actually trying to call out another phobia, Islamophobia. So at Georgetown's Bridge Initiative, for instance, there's a fact sheet that talks about the community approach to this, and it was described as quashing, academic freedom, threatening and harassing. I can assure you that none of the letters that we wrote had threats in them, but it's a way of perpetuating this idea that Hindus are dangerous and are threatening or violent. I'll give another example. This was released around the same time as the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference. And this is a Hindutva harassment field manual. And it is a product of the South Asia Scholars Collective, which has professors from Columbia, Georgetown, Santa Clara University, University of Washington, Yale, Aspen Institute, University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers, and several more. What you have is a demonizing of Hindu students. What this first does is that it problematizes the moves or the overtures as perceived by these scholars of India becoming a Hindu nation. But there are no such guides by these professors about the 43 other countries that might have an official state religion or 40s that have a preferred religion. But somehow they have found that they need to invest time and resources into creating a manual to warn of the dangers of right-wing Hindu nationalists on their college campuses. These are children, 18 to 22 or however old an average college student is. On this next page, and this is available online so you can see it, but they talk about who are these Hindu students that might be a danger to you. So the Hindu students are those that might espouse elite Hindu-centric ideas. What those are, we don't know. And who is the you that needs to be afraid? It is Muslims, Dalits, those who identify as feminists, and LGBTQ+. So if you are a South Asian fitting into this parenthetical, be aware of the Hindus on your campus. They might be out to get you. This is the sort of resource. It's not so much even that the resource exists, because I don't know how many people actually use it, but it's the asymmetry of power between professors who are presenting using the weight that comes with all of these leading institutions to demonize an entire community, and then by extension, those students that might be on their campuses. College is a time when you're exploring your identity. You should be able to answer or ask questions. You should be able to debate philosophical ideas. But when you have manuals such as these, it makes it very difficult to do that. And I'll, in the interest of time, I'm just gonna, I have 5 minutes. Okay, I'm good. So I'm going to shift into Hinduphobia in the public square. So if you recall, if you can just see these headlines, far-right Hindu nationalism gaining ground in the U.S., Hindu nationalism, right-wing nationalists, Hindu nationalists, all of these things, it doesn't matter where Hindu Americans align with or advocate for causes long considered quote-unquote progressive in the American political space when it comes to free speech, religious liberty, separation of church-state, LGBTQ equality, cultural proficiency in education, environmental responsibility, even just overall diversity and belonging. not only anecdotally, but even most of the surveys that are conducted, whether it's the Pew, whether it's Carnegie Endowment for Peace, show that Hindu Americans on a whole lean left. Yet, as Hindu Americans get involved in the political space, and I don't know how politics are here in Canada, but there you have to grease hands to make things happen. I mean, it's a very transactional exercise where different communities support candidates financially in the hopes that their candidate's going to win. This is not anything out of the norm. However, when Hindu Americans have started getting involved, whether they're running for office or whether they are contributing, they're asked to almost pledge their loyalty. They're asked to condemn the Indian government if they promote nuanced understandings of the US-India relationship or might be positive towards a particular policy of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party in India. There's not space for that. They have to condemn. And so then their loyalty is questioned. Now, some of the portals that I have are kind of fringe portals, right? But the problem is that you get enough of these and they start getting picked up by mainstream media. So we see these narratives in Mother Jones, in Politico, New York Times, and the Washington Post. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'm just going to end with one last video. And this is something that kind of intersects both policy as well as college campuses. Over the past several years, there's been a move to institutionalize caste into non-discrimination policies across the country. Now, the way that non-discrimination law or the apparatus has been built in the United States is by having broad neutral categories: race, gender, religion, ancestry. None of these single out any particular group, but they provide a broad umbrella of protection. Where caste differs is that it is singularly associated with India and specifically Hinduism. So you're looking at a stark departure from well-established legal principles of neutrality and general applicability. But what's most disturbing is kind of some of the impetus behind it, which I think what has happened with policymakers is, well, yeah, we're opposing discrimination. That's a good thing. They're not going down one layer deeper to see what sort of things are actually driving these policies. This is a video montage put together by an online group called Hindus on Campus, or Hindu on Campus, and it's a student-led movement. It has nothing to do with HAF, and they have put together these types of resources to educate the public or bring awareness to Hinduphobia.
Everywhere South Asians go, particularly dominant caste Indian Hindus, they take caste. What is it that they do except, make scriptures that enslave our people?
I know that there are people who find meaning in books like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, but every act of Hindu scripture has done nothing but bring violence and pain.
And the Nazis aren't Germans in fucking Europe. They're actually upper caste Indians. It's really time to disrupt every single space where Hindu nationalists come into play, and it's every single person in the diaspora is culpable for the genocide that's happening right now in India, because upper caste networks in the United States help to fund the rise of Hindu nationalism. That we also have a structural responsibility as South Asians to really come for our fucking Hindu nationalist relatives. As they see on the line right here, is to come for your saffron auntie and uncle, because those people are not casual fascists. Caste networks have allowed a genocide to occur on their watch and have been reformist roadblocks to institutions of policing and violence.
The whole idea of Aryan race theory and swastika, in fact, they come from Hindu religious beliefs. So in this context, what you see is that, the Hindu fascism and Nazism have a very interesting, correlationship. Right? Celebration of Diwali is like asking an indigenous person to celebrate Columbus Day.
Namaste is actually part of a caste discrimination in India.
that's a student-run effort. I will just end now. That in an age of scholar activism and activist journalism, at times complicated by foreign funding, lines get blurred between legitimate fact-based inquiry and Hinduphobia. And campuses, rather than teaching students how to think, the emphasis shifts to what to think. And rather than reporting events in the media to inform readers, it emphasizes to promoting a particular view or agenda. Ideology drives scholarship and reportage rather than integrity. I'm generally an optimist, but the alliances or ecosystems here that have been built on an access to institutional power, fueled by resources, and fortified by the legacy of colonialism, religious exclusivism, and racism, pose for me a very dire picture of the road ahead for the rights and dignity and well-being of not only Hindu Americans, but Hindus across the diaspora. And that's why I think it's all the more important to understand, recognize, and call out Hinduphobia. And my hope is that an operationalized definition will be the first step towards that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shukla. Now, do I understand that Professor Esposito is going to be zoomed in? Is that correct? Okay, so I'm going to take a little time as he's zooming in. And just spend a couple of minutes now if there are some questions or observations that anybody wants to make. He's here when you're ready. And there he is. Welcome. Can you hear me? Welcome, Professor
Delighted
Esposito.
to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me now?
One question. I was very confused with the previous speaker's presentation. The name that I was seeing was Amanda Rossini. Was that Amanda? Because there was someone else who was...
No, that wasn't. That was Suhag Shukla. Shukla.
Okay. All right. Yeah,
That's all right.
It was coming up
That's okay.
incorrectly.
That's all right. I'm just going
okay.
to, not that you need an introduction, but I'm going to give you one here to the group that is assembled and let you, so relax. Relax, Professor Esposito, because I really do want to be able to introduce you here to yet another generation that perhaps does not know you in person this way, but only through your many works. Professor Esposito is the Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Religion and International Affairs and founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative Protecting Pluralism. You will see in the material that was gathered for you the number of books that he has written, and I think that there are many of us in this room who have gained a great deal because of his writing and have been pointed in the right direction with regards to such difficult issues as Sharia. Please welcome with me Professor Esposito as he shares his thoughts on the globalization of Islamophobia. Professor Esposito.
Yes, I've set my my iPhone to let me know when I'm within the 20-25 minute limit. So I apologize ahead of time if I am moving on too fast. I'm also looking at a text. I should be able to read it on my computer. In fact, I set everything up to do that. And for some reason, it's refusing to come up. If you just hold on for 1 second, I'll just double check and see, because it'll be a little easier for me to, yes. Oh, gosh. Oh, all right, there we are. God is good. Everything is coming together here. Okay, let me make a couple of initial comments. I'm trying to cover a lot of territory here. But to put into perspective, talking about Islamophobia, and its globalization. I would want to note that that basically from the U.S. and Europe to the Middle East and Asia, hatred and discrimination against Muslims and against Jews and Hindus, and we go right down the line, is now an ugly worldwide phenomenon and seeming to increase. American and European domestic and foreign policies and politics and the notion of a global war on terrorism, I believe, have played a major role in the growth of Islamophobia, both domestically and internationally. But the biggest crises of Islamophobia now exist also outside the Western world. The genocides with regard to the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya Myanmar, the growth of Islamophobia in India, and I'd be very happy to be in personal contact with my colleague that unfortunately, because of my brother's medical situation, I wasn't able to be there to talk personally. While often overlooked, the origins and roots of modern forms of Islamophobia in the West shape attitudes and government policies towards Islam and Muslims, influencing the current globalization of Islamophobia. It's important to note, just briefly by way of background, I come out of a monastery to begin with, okay? So from the age of 14 to the age of 24, my goal in life was to be a Capuchin Franciscan priest. I'm now married 58 years, so clearly I've seen that there's something else besides celibacy in life. But the fact is, when I then went to do my doctorate at Temple, it was not to study Islam, but in fact, I went there to do Catholic theology, to do a PhD, but I was required, as all of us were, to take a course in world religions. And so I wound up actually focusing more on Hinduism and Buddhism. And my professor then, Professor Chakravarti, thought that I should do a dissertation on the topic. Regrettably, the chair of the department, not regrettably, but he's a well-meaning person, really felt that I also needed to do something on Islam since they had just hired a Muslim. And I was very resistant. At a certain point, I finally agreed to take one course, and then things just moved from there. So I shifted then into another field. But I want to point out that prior to the Iranian Revolution, Muslims were seen, and Islam was seen somewhat invisibly. That is, people were seen as Egyptians, Lebanese, Iranians. You didn't have that kind of almost rubric and almost a univocal kind of understanding or definition until the Iranian Revolution came along. So for the average, certainly the average American, I was raised in New York, but also lived in other parts of the country, there wasn't any real significant presence of mosques and sense of really Islam in our curriculum. Examples I like to give is that the American Academy of Religions did not even have a section on Islam. It took us 4 or 5 years, us meaning my mentor, Ismail al-Faruqi, but graduate students mainly, to establish that we could have a section that had vibrancy to it. The Middle East Studies Association had very little coverage on Islam and very little on democracy, on both. So if you did study Islam, as if you were doing something in the ancient past. Therefore, when I finished my degree in the early 1970s, there were no jobs to teach Islam. And my Catholic colleagues, theologian colleagues, had been correct when they warned me about that. And so I was hired to teach world religions. It was not until, this would have been the early 70s, it was not until the Iranian Revolution that I had any kind of career. Prior to that, there was no interest in books, in publishing, speaking, etc. And so it was the Iranian Revolution that had many Americans, but also internationally people seeing, as it were, Islam. That is, every day with live television, they could see people in Tehran, shouting "Death to America," etc. It was in that context then that we begin to talk about the engagement with Iran and with Muslims as a threat suddenly. In a context in which before that, often in neighborhoods, etc., that wasn't even the way things were looked at. This gets exacerbated to the point where we begin to have people talking about the green menace and also using the phrase Islamic fundamentalism, very, very popular with the news. But it really takes off with the notion of clash of civilizations. Now, it's very interesting that before Sam Huntington published his Clash of Civilizations, literally a couple of months before, there was a panel at the Council on Foreign Relations, and several of us were on it, and he was one of the lead-off people. And the topic was something like the Middle East and Islamic fundamentalism, or religion. And Sam began by saying, I don't know why I'm here. I know nothing about the Middle East. The chair at that time, at the end of it, encouraged us to read the next issue of Foreign Affairs. And there was Sam's article on basically the Clash of Civilizations, in which Islam was a primary, Islam in China, and in which he began with phrases like, Islam has bloody borders. Not Muslim countries have bloody borders, but Islam has bloody borders. And then when he wrote his book, he added, Islam has bloody innards. That influence was enormous. Those that are old enough to remember it, this became very global. I was surprised at the number of Muslim scholars and others that I knew were asking me to get Sam to go to their country to discuss the book, etc., let alone in the corridors, as it were, in Washington, and also in my consulting in Europe. So what happens then post Clash of Civilizations is that it gets teased out in the next sort of decade, where you begin to see not only scholars writing, but journalists writing about Islam as a triple threat. The Islamic threat is a triple threat. It was political threat, a civilizational threat, and a demographic threat. As Pat Buchanan wrote, who at one point was also a candidate for president, he talked about how Muslims in Germany, Muslim doctors, worked late into the night in a kind of secular Germany that allowed abortion, performing abortions and supporting their growing families of 4, 6, and 8 children. So in other words, that the indigenous, if you will, the indigenous German, population was actually shrinking because of this, the ease with which you could have abortions, but also that the Muslim population was growing somehow. But the real kickoff takes place with 9/11. 9/11, and especially the notion of the war on global terrorism. I mean, on the one hand, President Bush went out of his way to go to a mosque and to say things like Islam is not the problem, but then he would say, why do they hate us? They hate our democracy. They hate art, with a whole set of things. He referred to the Crusades. His military used the phrase infinite justice. And in fact, the invasion of Iraq, when we had no weapons of mass destruction, became an invasion that was legitimated in the name of the promotion of democracy. And indeed, the way President Bush put it was for President Bush to acknowledge in his second term that in his first term, he, like all his predecessors, Democrat or Republican presidents, had practiced democratic exceptionalism. That is the promotion of democracy globally, with the exception of the Middle East. So all of that is by way of background. So you then have 9/11, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and that conglomeration, and then the role then that the media comes to basically play, as everything then is very often put under the rubric of a war on global terrorism. Not, in other words, not simply an incident in a particular country, but it was globalized. And even the use of the term Muslim was globalized. Much as, this isn't the same thing, my analogy is always limp. But if you look at today, too often we don't see a distinguish between the atrocities of Hamas and the vast majority of Palestinians who are not members of Hamas and who are becoming victims in the attempt, if one isn't careful, to rather than be surgical in going after the Hamas terrorists to basically drive out 1 million people out of Gaza, etc. Okay, so just moving along. What keeps this really alive and spreading, though, is the role of mass media. Now, I've done a lot of writing on it, and I don't have time to get into it. But if anybody's interested, I can send you some talks that I've given just that refer to some data. They're not all polished talks that were published. Some of them were, some of them weren't. But what you saw with mass media was a natural thing. First of all, if it bleeds, it leads. Just think about it. Look at your headlines today. The numbers of people that were killed in Maine, and the way that gets headlined, or the numbers of people that are killed in other parts of the world that otherwise we might not know about. But if it bleeds, it leads. And most importantly, the explosion of social media. Studies of social media, for example, in the United States, several studies have shown that as much as $225 to $250 million has gone to support far-right, often Islamophobic websites, or just far-right websites that happen to not like Muslims. So, it's not just a jihad watch. It can be something like Pajama Media, that where you have a cross of interest. And it's really social media that then causes this kind of broad explosion. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk about several countries as we talk about the globalization touching on Europe briefly, and then touching on Asia briefly, just to set this out. If we look at France, in response to the October 16, 2020 brutal murder of a secondary school teacher by an 18-year-old Chechen immigrant, the French Interior Minister called for swift measures against the enemy within, a reference to France's Muslim community. Their religion and culture was seen as a threat, and you could see it in the policies that followed. Under the banner of protecting the state from Islamic terrorism, French authorities launched a crackdown not just on extremists and terrorists, but also on the country's 6 million Muslims. The government carried out raids targeting Muslim civil society, marking 231 people for deportation, arresting dozens of others, classifying more than 50 Muslim associations for potential dissolution. Many French Muslims feared the government was weaponizing the killing to institute a government policy equating Islam with terrorism. Not simply some Muslims with terrorism, okay? One of the organizations the French authorities identified, ironically, for dissolution was a major organization, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, which was an advocacy organization that documented hate crimes against Muslims. The group had cited rising anti-Muslim sentiment in France and found that in 2019, there were nearly 800 anti-Muslim acts and 77% increase in 2 years. Yet, the French Interior Minister, with no proof, called the organization an enemy of the Republic. The government shut down at least 73 mosques and Islamic schools. Macron, being concerned about Marine Le Pen, the far right, and Eric Zemmour, Macron moved more to the far right himself in his language, so that at times it became elements of Muslim civil society that were seen as a threat, such as organizations that tracked how Muslims were being treated, what the behavior was like. You see this criminalization of political Islam very clearly when you then look at Austria. And France and Austria move along the same lines at times. Austrian forces raided the houses of around 70 Muslim community leaders and academics across the country on suspicion of organizing terrorism and money laundering. It involved more than 900 police officers, special agents, and other officials. It was called Operation Luxor, named after the ancient city of Egypt. It was the largest coordinated police raid in Austria since the Second World War. However, after 2.5 years, and these people, by the way, many of them lost their jobs or their bank accounts were frozen, etc. After 2.5 years, the courts threw it out. According to Helmut Krieger, a political scientist at the University of Vienna, Operation Luxor, quote, was intended as a means to criminalize the politically active Muslims in Austria under the label of political Islam. See, not even using the word terrorist Islam, but just the idea that the involvement in politics, how the Austrian state understood political Islam was deeply influenced by the understanding that it had of coming out of Egypt and the what went on in terms of Sisi and the overthrow of the government, also the United Arab Emirates and Israel. But now we move to China. China has a bold form of Islamophobia, and one that it uses its technology to spread false information about its treatment of Uyghurs. It has imprisoned Uyghurs in what some would call concentration camps alongside increased and enhanced surveillance of their homes, mosques, and daily life. A man is taken out of a house, a government man is put in that house to observe the family. The state has also used social media in an attempt to combat reports of Uyghur abuse. In response to being accused of genocide, the state strategically launched a disinformation campaign, hiring social media influencers and creators. It's further entrenched this Islamophobia by spreading false information about its treatment of the Uyghurs. And there's lots of information out there that I think is not up for dispute as compared to some other areas in Asia. The other area that's been a real surprise is Myanmar, a country that yielded a Nobel, a Peace Prize winner who was admired so much, globally. In Myanmar, the former Burma, you see what happened to the Rohingya. More than 1 million driven out. There are videos that you can see, that you can look up, in which you actually see the kinds of destruction that took place. At times, they harnessed hardline Buddhist monks. This is not part of mainstream Buddhism at all, but hardline Buddhist monks who legitimated things that emerged as, in fact, setting fire to villages, having people killed, people thrown into the fires, etc. And these are pretty gruesome videos that are available. Where you run into a problem with Myanmar is that it led in many ways to a systemic genocide of the Rohingya. And in fact, there's been a kind of systemic genocide occurring in China to in fact, not just get rid of terrorists, but the threat that China sees, or what it doesn't want to see, is it wants its Uyghurs to be fully Chinese. And that means the language, the culture, etc., becomes primary. It's a little bit like Marie Le Pen once saying that for the ideal a Muslim who would become French, it would be somebody whose first language was French, whose first culture was French, whose first preference for food was French. So it's from that perspective. Now, the shortest treatment here, but I will say that anything that I've been talking about, if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, you'll see a collection of data and studies that are posted every day. And we have a report every day of 10 top stories internationally. And again, I would repeat that for anyone who is involved in this program, please do feel free to get in touch with me if you want to have a conversation about what you're concerned about in terms of what I'm saying or not getting a chance to say. But in India, there has been, from my point of view, a movement from what was celebrated for so long as a major secular democracy, and one which at times has movements and advocates for the notion that India should be seen as primarily a Hindu nation. And it's had impact on Muslims, yes, to a significant degree, but also on some Christians and Sikhs in terms of events that have been taking place, whether it's discrimination, whether it's at times bulldozing religious sites, or villages. It also is, there are multiple reports about human rights situations here, and these reports are not from, they come from international human rights organizations. In other words, not from people who someone might say, well, this is a person who says that they're like an expert, on Hinduism, a professor or something, who's making these kinds of statements. But there have been significant issues that have taken place in classrooms, issues about the hijab, issues about intermarriage, with the idea that there's somehow a love jihad, where Muslims are, deliberately targeting and trying to marry and convert. There also were early reports of blaming COVID-19 and its spread, on Muslims, and reactions to the extent that there was widespread reaction of people who within the country who believed that. Maybe that was an exaggerated a statement, but the reactions were significant. So let me just make a few brief comments about authoritarian Muslim regimes. I think we missed the point that they practice their own form of Islamophobia. And that is that what they wind up doing is not simply targeting extremist groups, but basically saying that any Islamic political or social movement, should be banned, or they will ban them, or they will attempt to shut them down, because they're worried about this alternative and its critique within their society. So, the threat, for example, was not simply that Morsi did the impossible, that is, that you had a member of the Brotherhood who could be the first democratically elected president. The threat to many was not even simply that he wasn't as competent as a president could be. It was that this could occur, because remember that for years, that double standard that Bush talked about, that double standard was fed by authoritarian regimes that basically said, you can count on stability and security if you count on our family-owned country, as it were, or governed country. You open up the system and you're going to have these extremists or terrorists. In other words, not a distinction between, if you will, mainstream religious, political, and social groups and others. As we knew existed in Egypt, you had dental care, medical care, education being provided to poor people that the state couldn't provide, and in a fair number of cases, and I observed it, the professionals who were involved were not themselves Muslim. Okay, so that's the question of the authoritarian regimes, and then the role that they wind up playing, not only in their own country, but with other countries. So, for example, the coup in Egypt, it's an established fact that it was greatly influenced and bankrolled by the UAE and to a certain extent Saudi Arabia. This becomes, an issue. And I think we see it here. And here I want to quote Jewish Voice for Peace. So I'm not quoting a Muslim organization. I'm not quoting myself or whatever. And this is a statement that it made a while back that I think is important. Islamophobia in Israel-Palestine is one of the least covered examples, and Jewish Voices of Peace succinctly underscored its importance in Israeli politics and its devastating impact on portraying Muslims and Arabs as the enemy and denying their fundamental rights. Okay. Here is an important and relevant excerpt from a fact sheet that they produced. Quote, Islamophobia plays a key role in building and sustaining public and U.S. government backing for Israel, meaning uncritical backing for Israel, I would say, as you'll see it's what's said. Right-wing Christian and Jewish groups dedicated to denying the fundamental rights of Palestinians deliberately fuel fear of Muslims and Arabs, commonly assumed to be Muslims, that is, forgetting that they're also Christians, to push their agenda in the Middle East. Unwavering support of Israeli policies contributes to the characterization of Muslims and all Arabs as the enemy. In other words, equating them, for example, with saying Hamas is the enemy. So you're not talking about the numbers of actual members of Hamas, etc., and the support that they have compared to the hundreds of thousands and onward and upward of those who are not members of Hamas. Rather than focusing on wealth and competition, leaders need to also foster a deep sense of our political and religious pluralism and interdependency. I think this becomes important with regard to the future. A money Islamophobia Israel network bound by ideology, money, and overlapping institution affiliations both furthers a rapidly anti-Muslim climate in this country and helps bolster the state-sponsored Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian policies adopted and promoted by the U.S. government. A clear example of this is to look at the Biden-Blinken government. You can look at previous governments, but particularly their policies, even their most recent policies. That is the uncritical support that President Biden, and I voted for President Biden, the uncritical support that President Biden gives to almost anything that Netanyahu says. And so a final paragraph, an impetus for the view that Muslims are enemies of Israel and the West came from the introduction in 1990 and the subsequent popularization of the term clash of civilization. The idea that Western civilization is locked in an implacable battle with Islam, resulting from fundamental cultural differences, not history, politics, imperialism, neocolonialism, struggles over natural resources, or other factors. The virulently anti-Muslim clash of civilizations concept views more than 1 billion Muslims as belonging to a monolithic, insular, inherently backward, violent, and inferior culture that cannot be changed. It provides an ideological foundation for both the war on terror and the militantly pro-Israel belief that the West must back Israel uncritically because of fear of large Muslim minorities, unassimilated and unassailable. We need, my last sentence, one long sentence, a new narrative. Despite rhetorical commitments to democracy and human rights, the US and the EU have consistently sided with authoritarian regimes. What former President Bush called democratic exceptionalism was ironically used to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq, all in the same of bringing democracy to Iraq and the Arab world while also supporting the status quo. In Egypt, the US, and the EU, if we talk about moving forward and beyond, the US, Europe, and the international community must not only construct a new narrative that emphasizes self-determination, government accountability, rule of law, and human rights, upon which political actions and policies are based, but they must also act on that narrative. This is something that no administration, including the Biden administration in the US, has been willing to do. That reinforces anti-Westernism and the mantra of militant extremists, and there are militant extremists, that neither Arab regimes nor their Western allies will allow democratization. And this mantra can fuel radicalization and recruitment. So I'll end there. I got a little bit more. Sorry to go on a little longer than I should have.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Esposito. Where is the camera? There. Okay. All right. So he can see me then when I'm talking. Okay. Good. Are there any questions now to the three of our panelists or reflections? Yes, please come and speak, if you might, to the microphone.
Yes. So I want to raise a central issue in terms of comparing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Hinduphobia. I don't really have an opinion about it, but I want to raise a question. And I understand that from a human rights perspective, every form of discrimination is wrong. But I also think that from an historical perspective, there are differences. And I mean, we heard a lot about recent developments in Islamophobia and Hinduphobia, but if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, it's very ancient, and it has always been very widespread. So we're talking about more than 2,000 years of extreme forms of violence. So I think from an historical perspective, we cannot equate them. From other perspectives, I think we can, but from an historical perspective, I think we can't. So what do you think about that?
I don't disagree with you. My point is to bring the underlying themes that overlap, and oftentimes the sources today, where many of the same spaces that we're seeing arise in Hinduphobia, anti-Semitism has been a mainstay in those spaces. In terms of scale, we're not facing anything close to what the Jewish American community is facing in the United States. Historically, of course, there's the Holocaust, but I would also say that there have been genocides that are religious-driven of Hindus that are not yet studied. Whether those are equivalent, I'm not going to say. That's for a historian to find out, and to me it doesn't really matter. What matters is that people today are getting hurt as a result of otherizing and dehumanizing people on the basis of their faiths.
I'd like to comment.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I think this still works. Yeah? Okay, good. So yeah, I agree also. I think I've explained at the beginning of my presentation how anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hatred, and I also... Oh, it stopped?
There you go.
It's good? Okay, so I explained how anti-Semitism is a very ancient form of hatred, and I explained how it has certain specificities. But I also, and I think that's very important, I think that all forms of hatred attack all of us and attack the society and the social fabric that makes our societies. And that's why I think there's definitely things we can draw from one another, learn about one another, and in making up solutions to combat these forms of hatred. You were mentioning that you're hoping that there's going to be a working definition of Hinduphobia. And I was trying to respect the time earlier, so I didn't get into it, but we have a working definition of anti-Semitism. And so it has been a very valuable tool to help identify what is anti-Semitism and what are the forms in which it manifests itself, in the hopes that civil society, law enforcement, the education system, also on campuses, you mentioned the issue on campuses, there's big issues on campuses, and how we can identify anti-Semitism, or how we can identify Hinduphobia, and how we can identify all types of hatred and racism and combat them. And so for the definition of anti-Semitism that I'm referring to is the one developed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's a consensus definition that has international consensus that was developed in 2016 by 31 member states, including Canada, and Canada has officially adopted it also since 2019. And I just want to read it to you. So anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institutions, and religious facilities. But something that was extremely interesting in your presentation was the importance of identifying the specific forms and manifestation, and in the definition that you're working on. So the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, it includes also a set of examples of manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism. It's not a binding definition. It's really meant to be as a tool for people that I've mentioned, like law enforcement or government or any civil society stakeholder, to identify what is anti-Semitism. I won't read all the examples, but maybe I'll just mention a couple. So, one of the examples that's mentioned of anti-Semitism is making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, as such, or the power of Jews as a collective. And the myth about a world of Jewish conspiracy or Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other social institutions, right? So I was talking about conspiracy theories. That's a form of it. Denying the fact scope mechanism like the gas chambers or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of the National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II, the Holocaust. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, like all people on earth have a right to self-determination, so does the Jewish people. And one other example is holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. There was rallies that erupted after October 7 and the Hamas attack against Israel that were in the streets of Montreal celebrating, passing around candies, the murder of 1,400 people. And as a member of the Jewish community, seeing that this is celebrated, which is actually the biggest number of Jews murdered in one day since the end of the Holocaust, that's extremely concerning. In Sydney, Australia, a few days ago, same thing, there was an anti-Israel rally, and the participants at the rally were chanting, "Gas the Jews." Not gas the Israeli, gas the Jews. So I think we have to be very careful when we're looking at the ways those hatred manifest themselves and shape themselves, and it could be very pernicious. And I think that it's extremely important to use these tools, to have definitions, but then to come together and see how we can all together combat all the different forms of hatred. So I'll stop there for this long answer. I hope this answers your question.
Thank
you. My name is Evangelist Kwasi Donyina from Ghana, but I've been here since 1967. I came here as a McGill student, but I lived a block away from here. I am a minister of religion, and sometimes I have to hold back phobia. For example, one of my pastors in Zambia, he was preaching and was beaten to death by Muslims. Right now in Pakistan, they've burned so many Christian churches, and one of my pastors is in jail. Now it's going to High Court. Now, as a Christian, I'm a Messianic Jew. That is, Jews that have accepted Christ as Savior. I find it difficult not to hate Muslims. But again, being a Christian, say, love your neighbors. Now, the whole world, we have all religions, Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Why can't we live in peace? We are all worshiping the same God. Why should we say that Allah is higher than God or Jesus or this? Why are we killing ourselves?
Thank you. Well, this has been a phenomenal afternoon, and I think we've hit on so many of those hotspots that we don't like to talk about. We don't like to talk about specifically in public because we feel that we don't have enough time to unpack sometimes our own emotions, not our own thinking about things. When you were speaking, Professor Esposito, I too was wondering just how far my friends in Gaza would understand anything that was going on here in this room at this particular moment, and whether or not they really cared. But because of them and because of my friends in Israel, because I know that all of you have friends all over the place that are for one reason or another, hit time and time again by an inability to cross over bridges, that this kind of meeting and exchange of ideas is important, even though we don't have enough time. And I just hope that, when we come to listen to Professor Loeffler later in the afternoon at 5:30, and then retire for a reception, that we will be even better placed to come at these issues than tomorrow. So please join with me to thank all three of our panelists this afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you. As I said, there's a slight break now, and we will meet again for our keynote speaker, Professor Loeffler. Thank you.